So today we're going to get into the basics of creating out a paper cutout in Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop. It's going to be a cross-program project in which we can look to draw out the simple illustrations in Adobe Illustrator and then add the effects with Adobe Photoshop. It helps to just replicate the layer styles that we need to apply on to create something a little bit more interesting. To start out, we're going to look to create out a new document. I'm going to make the size of my document 8 by 12. Width is 12 inches, going for a wider format layout, and height is going to be 8 inches. The document settings, because if I get into printing, I'd probably recommend do CMYK, but RGB works as well. Just understand that whatever color settings you do have will have to stay that when we export it over for Photoshop. 300 ppi is very important. We want to make sure to have the highest resolution. And then once we have these settings, we can hit create. We get a new blank document to start out with. I can start building out a landscape or whatever type of design that you can think of. This work is inspired by Michael Figoso, a popular Illustrator designer. Definitely check out his work, Fugostrator on Instagram. But to begin with, we are going to look to start drawing out shapes. And I'm probably likely going to start by building from the background forward, adding in elements as we go. We start out with first a rectangle to give me a background sky. It's okay if I go outside of the artboard. I eventually will crop this so we don't have anything extending from it. You can get into adding in gradients, but you can also keep it very simple, just using standard default colors. And I'll probably do a combination in between for my design here. Just bear with me as I go through the design. It can be adding in anything from mountains, sky, clouds, birds. If you have hot air balloons, whatever you can imagine to put in your design, it's really up to you. The most important part is that we are not going to have strokes. We're going to use a flat design, and the effects that we apply onto it will help separate those images later on. I can also look to create some interesting dynamics so that the sky is not so just flat itself. If I decided that I wanted to have a little bit of range of color or different variations of blues within my sky, I could look to change it up or add in elements that are going to sit on top of these features. So I can look to change out my color. If I go over to my color guide, I can pick out different samples of colors, pick out a swatch, and if I take a look at my color guide, I can pick out darker or lighter variations, tints and shades to change up the color settings. I'm going to go a little bit darker for the top image, and then I'm going to look to draw out other layers. And the most important part of drawing out layers is that we have to separate them out into individual layers. Individual layers, if we take a look at our layers panel, if you get in the routine of hitting Command L, it adds a new layer. And each new layer that you add, we want to create a different layer for each shape that we possibly draw. When converting it or exporting it over to Photoshop, it's going to be a lot easier if everything is organized into separate layers, rather than having to reorganize everything when you're all done with the illustration. So just Command L, remember that. I'll also put it up in the top bar so you can see this at all times. Command or Control if you're using a PC, plus L. Just making sure you can see it at all times as we go through the design. So if I wanted to show some range of sky, maybe darker variations, I can start to draw it out. But you can see that I'm on layer 2 versus layer 1, which is my light blue in the background. I can click on the anchor point to cut off anchors and look to draw out new pieces. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so I can see this all better. So I can, again, use different color ranges. Just make sure you know what layer you're working with. Once I have my one shape, again in the routine, Command or Control L creates a new layer, and then I can start drawing out another shape. And you can see that your layers do change with the outline color. Just understand that each one is applied. We can always change the layer later on, or the outline that we're seeing with this lime green here. We can always adjust to something different. Once I have the sky elements that I have, I'm going to, again, add a new layer. This time I'm going to deal with clouds. Command L creates out a new layer. Now for building out shapes, I can use a combination of shapes. If I decide that I want to do groups of clouds, I can make a number of different circles overlapping each other. I'm going to change these out to white so I can visibly see them better. So with all these shapes, I'm going to look to select out just these circles, deselecting from the other shapes. With these now all selected, I can go over either to my shape builder and click and drag through, as we see with the sample, or you can go up to your Pathfinder tool over on the right side navigation. If you don't see your Pathfinder, you can go up to Window at the top navigation and down to Pathfinder in alphabetical order. But with this, I'm going to click on the first option, which is Unite. It combines them into one shape, and now I have a cloud that can be floating in my sky. I'll do this a few more times, again, making sure I create out a new layer over in the Layers panel and building out a couple different clouds so that they're a little bit different shape each time. So holding Shift, I can deselect out any other layers, just clicking and dragging through, or select them as well. But again, Unite combines them into one shape. Move this piece around, and I'll add one more cloud for the effect. Using the shapes, and again, Unite one last time. So 3 different clouds for the sky. Now I can get into adding some landscape. I'll start out with some mountains in the background so it's not so flat. Again, over the pen tool, I like using the pen tool for drawing out curves. Again, make sure that you are creating out the different layers. I can always change an angle, just click on the anchor point, and then I can adjust to make one curve adjust to a different angle. Because I'll have layers over top of it, I can just cut halfway through the design. And I'm just going to pick out a new color. If I want to do a gray, I might want to add a little bit of tone or a little bit of color, just so it's not so flat gray. If I wanted to see this cloud in front of my mountain, I would have to move this layer over in the layers panel above that shape. I'm going to go back over the pen tool, create out a new layer. It's going to be my second group of mountains. One's in the front of the other. Again, I'm just going to add in a little bit blue tint, or I could possibly add a little bit of green tint, just so it starts to bring in the green grass that I'll eventually pull into the color mountains. I do want it a little bit lighter. And even though that they are not necessarily separating much here, they will once we start to add in the shadows and highlights over top of the subjects. So next I can get into adding this more ground area. Again, creating a new layer, hitting Command L. Picking out a little bit more dark green first, and then we can start to add in layers on top of these to make it a little bit more interesting. So again, creating a new layer. And if I forgot to create out a new layer, I can always create out a new layer later on. And be sure you have the new layer selected where I can paste in the piece that I deleted out and replaced in. Next up, I'm going to add some water just to give some break of the landscape. If I wanted to add in maybe an island or something that's going to help separate out the water, I could add another feature or add in elements. I'm also going to add in some foreground. Just so I can add some features, some details, make this a little bit more interesting. Again, if you keep forgetting to create out new layers, you can always select the piece, make a copy, and then paste it onto the new layer that you create. So I'll create out one more layer for the foreground before I add in a couple little bit more details. If I want to sample a color, I have the object I have one selected. I can match out a color. I'm just going to move this layer underneath. If I want to change the color, I can always adjust. So as I start to add in, or once I've completed adding in the bigger details, then I can start to add in a little bit smaller detailed elements, whether bushes, trees, grass elements. It's up to you to figure out what's going to work for your design. So I currently have the object for the 13 objects selected. It's going to allow me to get the color I want. If I wanted to throw in a couple pieces of grass, I can draw out some grass. I could always change the color or keep the color as is. If I were to change the color, you can see that we can get some separation. But I'm going to keep it as the same color so it all becomes one when we do combine it later on. Feel free to fast forward as needed. Just giving you a general idea of how they can be broken down or how we can add in shapes. If I decide that I want to add in flowers, I can also combine out shapes as well. And again, this is going to be part of the same layer, so I am going to keep this all drawn on the same layer. So that it's just going to add the effect to everything at once. So a little 5 circles. I'm going to go over to my Pathfinder. Use the Unite. And I can throw or change this color out to a purple, but I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. Just make it softer. So I could use this as a foreground element, making a flower. If I want to make a duplicate, I can always hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard, depending on the program that you're working with. To add in another feature so this stands out a little bit later on, I'm going to create a new layer. Just add a yellow circle to represent the middle of the flower. If you wanted to separate and do more petal work, show the petals on different layers, you absolutely can. So if I didn't want them to be part of the green grass, I can copy, Command or Control C, and I'll create out a new layer first. Command F, paste them on. You can see the yellow circles that make up the thing are layer 15, whereas the purple is underneath of it. I'm going to get into adding a tree. A couple different ways of doing a tree. You could always click point by point, drawing out the branches. If I wanted to have it on this little island, I click point by point, make smaller branches. And getting close, because we're dealing out with the same shape. Just remember, make sure that you're dealing and have your layers organized. I'm going to create a new layer and make sure this is at the top layer. So again, clicking point by point allows me to draw out a tree. There's a number of different ways that you can draw out a tree shape. One method that I've recently got into looking at, and we'll take a look in a second, is using the pen tool and using a stroke and using a more customized stroke. But first we'll take a look at how we can modify this tree. If I did want to add branches, I could always add in branches to the side. Remember that they will be on different layers, or they will be on the same layer because I haven't separated them onto a different layer here. But if I wanted to have another branch somewhere in between, I can always click point by point to draw out a new shape. So if I wanted to combine these pieces, again, I could always go over to Unite. They aren't necessarily needed, just understand that they are currently part of the same layer. I'm going to change this color out. Other methods, if I wanted to have a foreground tree, take a look at that in a moment. Going to create a new layer. And again, like I said earlier, we're going to take a look at what happens when we use a stroke to draw out your shape. Instead of having just a line itself, I'm going to go over to my stroke panel. And with my stroke panel, I'm going to change this to a thick to thin profile. So if I were to adjust the thickness of this, or I go into the weight, we see that we can start to get a thicker trunk area. I want to get into resizing this, moving it up, absolutely can. But this process will allow me to be able to draw in other branches as well. And I can also add in more curved branches, so it has a little bit more flow to it. But I'm going to hit escape to enter the line. And again, I can adjust the profile here. See how it adds in that thickness to the branch. Then we can draw other additional branches from that piece as well. And where I start is where it's going to be thicker. I can also play with our width tool. With the width tool, I can go over to an angle, look to stretch out pieces. Again, giving me different thicknesses, different weights. So if I were to go to this trunk area, expand it out, I get a very wide tree or narrowed out. The width tool is a very new tool to Illustrator, and it works very well. It's just a matter of understanding how you can modify the lines. So again, with the width tool, if I go over to one handle, I can stretch an area out. I do want to keep it to the body. Again, I don't even have to go over to the different profiles. I could just go over to the line that I want to modify, and you can see how it modifies the thickness of that line. So I can continue to add in more branches. Shift W is the shortcut key if I wanted to adjust the thickness on my own. Again, just jumping back over the pen tool, adding in lines. So all these different paths make up this single layer. Take a look at all these different paths. But I'm actually going to go up to Edit, down to Expand Appearance, and then use the Unite from the Pathfinder to combine them into one shape. So we have a second tree, close in the foreground. We're going to adjust the placement a little bit, and put it on an angle. And the tree in the background, and move out to the edge of the water. I'm going to shrink it down, just to show that we are showing depth. I can also consider adding in other elements. Maybe I want to have a house, or I want to have bushes. I want to have bushes around the edge of the water. I'm going to make sure again to create a new layer. I could also use the same type of shapes for leaves on the tree. If I want to group them or separate them out, I'm going to paste it onto a new layer. Again, just to show some variation, I want to change up the colors. Look to add in more of maybe a seasonal type of leaf color. Maybe we can play with those leaves later on to add in more dimension and development in the design. So we have a couple different elements going on. I'm not necessarily going to go too complicated with the design. Just for the overview, one last element I will throw in is a small house across the water. So I'm going to go over the shapes, use my rectangle tool, draw out, say, the front of the house. If I want to modify any angles, I can play with the distortion, adjust the perspective, and I'm going to change out the color. Let's go with a standard color for right now. I'm going to do it on a couple different layers. I can use the direct selection tool to adjust the perspective. I want to change out a color just so we can see the difference between the shades. We see how we're breaking it down, adding in a little bit of difference between the sides. Create out a new layer as well for a roof. I'll change this color as well. Let's go a little bit more subtle. Any additional elements, I can look to add in doors or windows, just so it has some type of separation. But again, I likely will create a new separate layer. So taking a look at my layers, I have layer 27. Nothing on it right now, so draw a door entrance. And use a square for, say, a window cutout area. And again, if I want to play with distortion, I can use the perspective tool or use the free distort. So these two window shapes I want to actually cut out from this part of the building. So I can use the shape builder, hold down Alt or Option, cut them out, and we see green right now, and that's okay. Just gives a sense that it is hollow inside. But we have an overall scene that we can work with. Now that we have this scene, I might add in one last element. I have in a couple leaves that are floating through the sky. And use the pen tool to draw in a leaf shape. Taking a closer look. Change the color out. Sample out, say the color of one of the tree bushes. So it's one leaf. I'll take out a couple more. Again, I can just hit Command C, Command V, makes a copy, and I can rotate these around. So we get the sense that they're kind of floating off the tree or flying off the tree. So we have our shapes out. Now that we have our shapes, we're going to look to export this. Go up to File, down to Export, Export As. It's important to change out our format. We're going to go into a Photoshop file so it maintains our layers. And I'm just going to call this Landscape Cutout. I can save it for my downloads. Important part, because we started with a CMYK, we want to make sure to keep the CMYK setting. Resolution, again, I want to make sure it's on 300 ppi. And I'm going to make sure that my right layers is selected. And click OK. It's going to take a minute to process. Also, don't forget to save your actual Illustrator file. Again, I call it Landscape Cutout. I'm going to save it onto my computer. Keeping it as an Illustrator file. One element that I forgot to make sure to do, I'm going to go back over to File, Export, Export As. I want to choose artboards, and it will trim off this excess around the image. So again, changing out to Photoshop file, Export. I'm going to replace it. But again, CMYK, right layers, but that trimming the artboard allows me to get exactly the design that I want. Now that I have it, I go over to Photoshop. In Photoshop, I'm going to go up to File, Open, choose out the Landscape Cutout, and click Open. So if we take a look at our layers, I didn't get into labeling the layers itself, but I can see them based off of the design. What I'm going to look to do is start building from the background. Right now I currently have this background path, and I'm going to add in some effects. If I go down to FX at the bottom of the layers panel, or double click on the layer itself, it brings up my layer style. And I can start to add in effects as I go. First one that we're going to be adding is the bevel and emboss. With the bevel and emboss, we're looking to get a highlight or ridge on top of this shape. I'm going to reduce my size down so it's not too thick. But adjusting your settings, we're looking for a white edge on the top element of this. Again, not too thick, not overpowering the design. I'm going to adjust the angle of it slightly, about 125. That way, when I look at it, you can see that it's affecting the highlight on the left side, and you don't really see it on the right side. It's meant to give a sense that the light source is coming from the top left. If I wanted to increase the highlight, I could always adjust the opacity at the bottom. You see how bright white we can get. I don't want to be that bright white, so I'm going to put it back down to 50%. If you wanted a little bit more, you can experiment, see what works for you. When it comes to other objects that might be showing the bottom other side of an object, you could always reduce your opacity of the shadow mode. But for my settings right now, once I have a bevel and emboss that I like, again, settings wise, the depth itself, you don't want to go too crazy with. I'm only going to have it about 75, just so I can see that little highlight. Size for myself is about 8. If I were to adjust this up, you can see that we get a very soft edge. That's not what we're looking for. If I want a little bit bigger, I can, but again, just be careful. Soften, we do not want to soften. We want to create the edge as if it were a piece of paper. Then once we have the bevel, we're going to go down to drop shadow. With the drop shadow, I'm going to first change out my color, so it's more of a black color. But I can modify my blend mode to be either linear burn or color burn, so that's a little bit softer, matching to the background color. If I modify my distance, again, I'm going to keep the angle at 125 throughout everything. But where we're really going to affect change is how we modify our size and our distance. The distance, I don't want it to be too far away. I want to have a little bit of shadow affecting on the object. And it's best to kind of see it in with the multiply blend. It's not necessarily going to matter too much right here with the shadow, but I am going to reduce the size. It's a little bit too strong. We're just trying to create some depth from the background. I can always modify this more, but just understand that we're not just going to be doing one shadow. We're going to have 2 shadows, because what is called like a step shadow, it helps that you have to imagine that there's probably more than one light source, and it'll create the more realistic interpretation if we adjust and create another shadow that is standing off an object. For the opacity though, with this second shadow, I'm going to reduce it, make it a lot softer. And again, it's just meant to create a little bit of depth with the object. I'm going to click OK for this piece. Rather than redoing this same exact effect, or applying these same effects one by one, I could right click on the effects I just did, hit copy layer style, and say I want to do the same effect for the layer 3 right above. Right click on it and paste layer style. We see that it adds in that ridge, that separation, creating the illusion of the paper stacking on top of each other. I can do this for the mountains as well. Right click, paste layer style. And we get that depth, and now as we start to see over the ridge on the right side of this mountain, we're getting not only the highlight on the left, but the shadowed area over on the right. It's a little bit darker shadow. If I do want to modify the shadow a little bit more, create some separation, I can double click on the shadow effects. I first have my top drop shadow, If I want to reduce it, if it feels too strong, I can reduce the shadow down, but I also may want to modify the distance, pushing it further away from the object. Once I modify my first shadow, my second shadow is likely going to be spread even further. Once I have these settings, I'm going to click OK. And again, I'm going to copy this layer style and look to apply it onto my next set of mountains. Paste layer style, and we see how it's adding on to that element. So we get the highlights, we get the little shadows, we get the shadows behind the object. And soon we'll come back to talk about how to add in a little bit more depth. But now we're going to take a look at one of our clouds. I can paste the layer style again, see how it affects the object. And we get a very drastic shadow sitting underneath. You may want to modify this because it's too strong. If I want to reduce it, again, I can move down the distance. And I'm going to drop the size. It's a little bit too strong over top of the object. I can soften up or drop the opacity as well if it's too strong. Same thing with my second drop shadow. Size is just a little bit too much for what I want. Opacity can be a little bit softer. So it looks a little bit nicer overall when sitting on top of those mountains. Again, I'm going to copy this layer style and now look to paste it onto my other clouds. I want to select out my clouds. I know that they're lower, but I'm going to paste those on and do that as well for layer 4. Now we're really starting to play with the depth of this piece. I can click on each layer as long as I have my auto select on. And again, I can look to start applying these effects onto these different layers. I'm going to copy the layer style from the mountains again, paste them onto the next levels of my landscape. So it goes on the dark green background. I don't really see much change, so I may want to go back and modify those later on. And again, not really seeing a drop shadow, so I am going to go into those settings. Probably reduce my drop shadow so I can get that shadow sitting behind the object a little bit better. My second drop shadow, again, the distance is probably too far up or too far down. So I'm going to bring it back a little bit. And if I want to bring a little bit more highlight, again, I can modify the opacity of the highlight on top of the object so we're getting better separation. So copy these layer style and paste it onto the green piece in front of it. Get a little bit better shadow sitting on there. You can do it for the water as well. Paste layer style. We get that highlight, we get that ridge. And I'll just go piece by piece, adding on those effects. This piece I do want over top of that island piece. Just make sure that you arrange your layers as needed. So you can see that it did add the highlights on the little pieces of grass that I did for the flower area. And even on the flowers themselves. It's a little bit strong, so I may want to modify that drop shadow again. Reduce the opacity, soften it up. I don't want it standing too far away. So once you start to copy and paste these settings, it's very quick and easy to add in all these elements. It really does start to show that sense of depth, or pieces of paper stacking on top of each other. I'm not liking the effect or the shadows with the separation on the house, so I'm going to merge those two layers together first. Then I can add the effects onto that. We see that stands out a little bit better to what my preference is. Drop shadow on top of the roof, a little bit too strong. Again, just going back in the settings. Going to reduce that down and cut down the distance and size so it's a little bit softer. Again, with the second drop shadow, just reduce down the distance a bit and size so it's a little bit softer. The other element I do have are these leaves. I'm going to paste in an effect on my leaves. See, we get the leaves kind of floating in space. I could always adjust the location as well if I'm not satisfied with location. But we now have the basics of adding in depth on these objects. What I can go back to and look to modify. I'm not necessarily satisfied with the effects, so I'm going to look to modify and adjust the settings. Drop down the drop shadow so it's not so strong, or reduce the opacity so it's not as pronounced. But now I want to start thinking about getting into textures. Adding textures into this, a couple different methods that we can look at. First, we want to get into adding in highlights and shadows onto objects. So if I have my mountains in the background, we'll do the first level mountains right in the middle. I'm going to hold down Control or Command on my keyboard and click on the thumbnail of that layer, so it puts a selection just around this piece. I'm then going to go over to my brush tool. And with my brush tool, I want to pick out a standard soft round brush, and my brush is going to go quite large for this. But we want to make sure that our foreground and background are going to be black and white. And we can always hit X to adjust the color, so the black's on top or the white's on top. Just hit X to switch those two out. But again, my brush is going to go quite large to add in these highlights and shadows on these objects. And this cuts out the issue of adding gradients to colors every time. So for my highlight with the selection around it, I'm actually going to click outside of the object, and it's going to add in a highlight over top of pieces. It's just giving a little soft edge around these pieces, not overpowering it, but helping to create a separation from the top and bottom. Again, if I hit X, now I put the black on. Using the black, again, not in the visibility of where the selection is, but where it's hidden, I can add in shadows to create a little bit more depth and separation from the two. If I want to switch them out, again, I could look to add in a little bit of highlight. So I'm adding in separation. Now when I deselect, you can really see the difference of these mountains. And if I do the same process with the mountains behind, I'm going to click on the move tool, select it so I know which layer I'm working with. I'm going to duplicate it so we can see the difference between the two. So again, I'm going to hold down Command or Control, click on the mountainscape, click on our brush tool. I have white on the foreground, so I'm going to do the highlights first. Clicking on the top edge, but outside of the actual objects, starts to add in those highlights on top of these mountains. Then I'm going to hit X or switch, hit the little double arrow to switch the color out. Again, not in the visibility of the object, but still in the selection. I'm adding in a shadow effect, so darkens up those mountains, really separating them from dark and light. And again, if I do want to add in a highlight, I can go back in. Again, it's outside the area. So the reason why I did this, if I deselect, looking at the mountains, they look pretty good. It shows a little bit better separation from these mountains that are in front of them. But to see the difference, if I hide these mountains and show the previous mountains, the ones in the back right now look flat. But with the addition of those shadows, it just adds another element of depth. So consider adding in those shadows with the white and the black, so you can really get a separation. Unlike these, they're very flat throughout the entire thing of this gray color. Now they add a lot more depth and interest across the design. So I'm going to look to repeat this for most of the other objects as well. Going with the sky, looking at this piece, again, hold down Command or Control, select on the thumbnail. I'm going to do the highlight first. Switch out the foreground color. Now do the shadow. And if I'm looking at my thumbnail, it looks terrible because I am seeing all this black, but that's not visible within the scene. Just understand we're adding in elements to really make this stand out. So if I click off of it, you can see how much better of depth we're adding now to that shape. I'll do it for the next layer behind it. Again, hold down Command or Control. I'll do the shadows first this time. And then do the highlights. It did mute the colors a little bit. Just understand, if I do want to modify the colors, I could go to more of a bluish white or change the black to a more dark blue color. But don't overdo it. We're just looking to add in a highlight and a shadow off the object. I'll zoom out a little bit. So if the color becomes too muted, you're welcome to play with it. If I wanted to experiment, I could always go up to image adjustments, hue and saturation. Maybe I want to try adjusting my saturation a little bit more vivid. You can see that brings back some blue color inside of the image. I'll do that for each of the layers, just so we can see more vividness. But again, it does add a lot more separation, making the image a lot more interesting. So I'll look to do these highlights as well for other areas. I'm going to shrink my brush down a little bit. Again, doing the drop of the shadow underneath, and then I'll do the highlight sitting over top. Just gives a nice little element. I don't want to overdo it. Zoom out, go over to my brush tool, do the shadow first. Again, I'm not getting too close to the object itself, but allowing the softness of the brush to add in that shadow. Lake as well. For smaller pieces like the leaves on the tree, you may want to reduce the size of your brush. For the tree itself, again, same process. Because it's a bigger tree, I'll go back to bigger brush. Smaller elements like the leaves or the flowers, again, same process. You just want to make sure that we're creating a little bit of separation. Start out with the shadows first, smaller brush. Make sure to select out the object first. Over in the layers panel. Finally, the last step, and I'll actually get into the shadows as well and the clouds. You can see just looking at the cloud, it just looks a little bit more realistic in comparison to the flat white cloud. Just adds a little bit more dimension, so it's not so flat. So now we have a lot more depth overall to our image. If I'm going back just to show you the example of what we started with, you see how much more interest it creates adding in these shadows, these separations. Finally, the last piece is adding in texture. With the texture, you can select out individual pieces. If I wanted to add in effects onto an object, I could consider looking at the textures that are provided. If I want to go up to filter, down to I'm going to change my setting over to see what happens when I do an RGB. I don't want to merge. And the reason I'm checking this is just because the restriction of the filter gallery. With the filter gallery, it just provides me a different type of texture. So if I'm taking a look at one of my clouds, I want to keep it small texture. I don't want to overwhelm it. So that's overwhelming it. I go back over to filter gallery. The filters are very limiting on the options that you have here. See how that's not affecting it much. Rather than doing this, I'm going to add in some textures. To add in a texture, I'm going to go down to File, Place Embedded. I have a couple images that I've downloaded previously. Select out my first texture and place it in. This texture right now, I'm going to move the layer up all the way to the top. I can always hit Control Shift right bracket to move it all the way to the top. I'm going to scale it to fit the entire design. The most basic way of doing a texture is laying over top of it and then using a blend mode to blend it into the image. It's a matter of figuring out what is going to be the best option for your design. You obviously don't want it to overpower. If I were looking at the linear burn, it comes out way too strong. But these little textures that you add, you don't want it to take over the entire image. So playing with the opacity, you can get into adjusting it. But if I'm looking at my linear burn or my color burn, having a soft texture over top allows me to have some type of texture in the design without overwhelming it. You can see my opacity is reduced almost down to 20. So it's a very minimalistic design overall, or pattern overall. But what I do recommend is that you actually do individual textures on objects. So rather than sitting over top of the entire thing as one, you can look to place stronger textures over specific pieces. So if I wanted to put this texture over top of this cloud, I'm going to hide the texture for a moment and choose out the cloud layer. So I have the texture sitting right above my cloud shape. What I'm going to do again is hold Command or Control, select on the object, then reveal the texture. But I'm going to select on the texture layer and add a layer mask. You see that it only applies the texture on that object without affecting the other textures, or without the other objects. If I wanted to modify this, change out the texture, see what it looks like with the different blend mode, you can see how it's going to affect the object. And I'm also going to desaturate the color so I'm not getting this brown color over top of it. But looking at the opacity, it's at 100%. It's way too strong. With a little subtle element, it just makes it a little bit more texture-like of a piece of paper, or just a little bit dirtied up. Just creates out a better element. If you have other textures to work with, you can try any different type of paper texture. So if I were to go find a texture, I can type in paper texture. Make sure you find something that is relatively good quality. I'm going to save this image. And we'll try a different texture as well. So if I wanted to try different textures on different objects, let's say I wanted to do a texture on top of a tree, I'll look to add in a texture, File, Place Embedded. Choose out one of my two textures that I just downloaded. I'm going to place this over top of my tree area. With my tree, I'm going to hold down Command or Control, select out the object, and then add a layer mask onto texture 2. You see that it's sitting over top of it, but I'm going to adjust my blend modes so that the pattern is applied on top of it. And you see how much more interesting the texture of the tree is. But again, a little bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce the opacity so it's a little bit more subtle, and now it looks more like a piece of construction paper. If I were to do it for my leaves, I'll select on my leaves layer, go up to File, Place, Embedded, choose out my other texture. Mixing up the textures also creates an interest, like you grabbed random types of paper and we're trying to apply it. But again, I'm going to hold down Command or Control, click on the leaves thumbnail, then add a layer mask onto my texture 3, and then get into the blend modes. See what multiply looks like, or see what color burn looks like. Even linear burn, that just adds a lot more depth, or a lot more interest into that design. Again, it might be a little bit strong, so I could always reduce the opacity. But that's how you experiment. You really get to see the different type of elements that you can create. If I want to do a texture on my water, select out the water layer, place embedded, choose out my original texture 1. Hold down Command or Control, and again, add a layer mask onto texture 1. You can see how much more interesting the water looks when it adds a texture, but again, just dropping down the opacity so it's a little bit more subtle. And you would just continue to do this for all your different pieces. Place, embedded. Add a layer mask onto the texture, and then modify your texture over the object. Reduce the opacity, and now it's a lot more subtle, but it does give a nice element over top of the piece. So you'll continue to do that through the rest of the piece. If I want to add in textures onto my sky area, again, File, Place. I'm going to use the same texture here, but when I do the effect, see how it affects each of the 3 pieces. It's a low quality image, so you may want to experiment with a different or a higher quality texture. So I'll try texture 3 again. File, place embedded. We'll try child 2. It will start to take up a lot of space within your drive, to understand that. So make sure that you're careful with the images that you take out. But again, blend mode, try the effects, see what looks good for you. I'm going to duplicate this just so we can see the difference of if we added a texture onto this 3 separate pieces or just doing one. So add a layer mask, so it's only applying on there. Command or Control, add a layer mask onto that. But again, just play with the opacities, get the subtle textures that you want. You can play with different opacities so that they're not all the same or they look different. But now taking a look at the difference between this image versus what we started with. We have the flat image versus now having it raised. You can really see the difference in how much more interesting it is when it pops. So nothing really moved around, just a matter of adding those effects to really grasp and understand how the piece can really stand out. So I hope you enjoyed. Enjoy designing.